On this edition of Fed Gov Today with Francis Rose, the Postal Service may deliver from a new home base. The Pentagon's budget authorizers get down to business, and a potential purchase card crunch for every agency. Welcome to Fed Gov Today with Francis Rose. President Trump says he wants to move the United States Postal Service to the Commerce Department. The Postal Service has been independent of the executive branch of the federal government since President Richard Nixon signed the Postal Reorganization Act in 1970. Robert Shea is co-founder and partner of Gov Navigators. He's former associate director at the Office of Management and Budget. Scott Quell is vice president for civilian growth at Maximus. He's former chief financial officer and assistant secretary for administration at the Commerce Department. Gentlemen, welcome. It's great to have you both on the program. Robert, I start with you. What normally happens when one organization in government moves underneath the purvey of another organization in government?
Well, it's not that normal for it to happen, but generally the administration would propose, or someone in Congress would propose, a reorganization of that agency, the moving it from one to another. This would involve a lot of deliberation, and generally reorganizations are under the jurisdiction of the House and Senate oversight committees. In this case, we're talking about the Postal Service. That also falls within the jurisdiction of those committees. So it's actually fairly simple to the extent you're moving this through legislation. To do it administratively would be unprecedented. And then you've got a lot of other moving parts like the Postal Regulatory Commission and how or whether that would move, a lot of moving parts to consider.
Are there potential wrinkles also because, as I mentioned, it's an independent organ, it's not technically an executive branch organization at this point?
That's right, but it does have an appropriation. It is entangled with a bunch of different statutes, so it would not be out of the question for it to be brought back in to the federal government because it, as you know, it's been working under a deficit for many, many years.
Scott, welcome. It's good to have you on the program, too. What's your sense of why commerce is the landing spot that the administration is considering for the Postal Service?
Well, Francis, I would say, first, there is kind of a can-do culture amongst its exceptional career staff there. You need to launch a weather satellite, you go to Commerce. You need to implement the CHIPS Act, you go to Commerce. You need to connect broadband throughout the nation, you go to Commerce. So there is that spirit and that culture. It is an expert culture where you have, and I say that without the slightest bit of, it's not an arrogant question, it's simply a fact. If you're collecting and disseminating weather information, you're examining patents, you are analyzing and producing our country's economic data, you are running our census, and so you get the point. This is a very expert, very hands-on federal department. There is a tradition of excellent customer service. There was a Business USA initiative which connected 20 different federal agencies to small businesses through digitally. Now that was a number of years ago, but I thought it was a strong first effort. And there is a component, a bureau within Commerce, the Patent and Trademark Office, that does run on a fee-for-service basis largely. And there is, every 10 years, there is this massive undertaking called the decennial census, where hundreds of thousands of temporary workers under the census, permanent staff's leadership, are going to over 100 million households a year to collect data and then interpret it and disseminate it.
Scott hit on something that I think is important to consider too, Robert, and that is with the emphasis over the last two administrations, first Trump administration and then the Biden administration from your former office, on customer experience. Any place that customer experience is going to be emphasized is probably a good fit, at least to have some influence on what the Postal Service does. Is that fair to say, do you think?
I absolutely think it's fair to say. When I was at the Office of Management and Budget, and we were looking to consolidate a bunch of programs aimed at urban development, we looked to the Commerce Department because it's got an incredible relationship with the business community, and it was a natural place for those programs to go. Very, very well run, a diversity of missions unlike almost any other agency or department of the federal government. And this analog of the patent and trademark can't be understated. Nothing like the size and complexity of the Postal Service, but it is delivering a very complicated service, patents and trademarks, to people who pay them for that service.
Scott, what has to happen mechanically inside an organization like the Commerce Department, especially in the financial management shop, to be able to prepare to take on something of the size of the Postal Service? I imagine that's an extraordinary undertaking.
I would think so, because while Commerce has many strengths, and you can see why it might be considered as a landing spot, the fact is that you might be looking at an organizational apple versus an orange. You have so at Commerce, if you look at, I guess, the scale of Postal Service, and I'm certainly not an expert at it, but about 127 billion parcels a year delivered, day after day. The relentless expectation of every single day delivery of your parcel on time and at an affordable cost. If you consider that, compare that to Commerce, which once every 10 years will do a decennial census, right?
That's right.
And just imagine, and I can't imagine, I've been there, the focus and management attention on doing that once. And then to do it, that's your daily, that's the daily expectation. It has to be the daily expectation. On time, affordable, relentless delivery at a high quality. So that if you consider the scale and the complexity of running our nation's postal system, if you consider the, if I'm just imagining, no matter how capable a secretary, if the secretary is also the postmaster general, those are two pretty demanding jobs. It's the holidays, there's a weather emergency somewhere, and the holiday packages aren't being delivered. Sorry, Mr. Secretary, you're not going to go do that trade deal because you're going to be, I mean, it's just all, it's hard.
Structurally, what that
hard.
looks like is intimidating potentially.
I mean, again, I'm not mastering of the statistics, but I understand there might be 500,000 employees. At the Postal Service. You may have a quarter million vehicles. You may have about 30,000 facilities you're owning or renting. That's a lot when you're the Department of Commerce. Also a cabinet department, or as a cabinet department, you have 40+ thousand employees. Certainly there are lots of facilities. Certainly there's a lot of organizational complexity.
You're right to pinpoint the politics of this, because the Postal Service is an independent entity, but it's got a lot of constraints. So it's got to deliver to every address in the United States.
6 days a week.
It's got to rain or shine. It cannot willy-nilly raise the price of postage because they'll be held to pay among Congress's constituencies. And if you don't deliver, like the current Postal Service's service is declining, and the Postal Service had been really one of the shining lights, at least from a service perspective, of the federal government. And then, of course, its finances aren't keeping up. So those are headaches that the Commerce Department would inherit by taking on the Postal Service.
And grafting that into an executive branch agency when it's not now strikes me as maybe the most difficult piece of this. Is who would want to take that on in the executive branch when it's independent now, Robert? It strikes me as maybe the most difficult part of this.
I think it'd be difficult with any organization, and merging cultures is always going to be hard. The only thing I'd say about Commerce is that it is already a place where you've got a diversity of cultures and organizational types and missions, unlike almost any other department in the government.
What's the opportunity that you see? There's a short-term win here we were talking about before we went on the air, Scott. What is that, and how would you advise Commerce to try to maximize on it if this happens?
I would pick one area common to both organizations where there's need and strength. Because of Commerce's excellent history of both digital and call center consolidation, customer service, like delivering the customer service. When there's a call, when there's an email, where there's a text, where's my package? I can imagine that essential layer of touching the customer, digitally, phone, and otherwise. Maybe that very complex service could be thought about as maybe consolidated or delivered at Commerce on behalf of the Postal Service, and let the Postal Service then focus the remainder of its resources in other ways. Might be an idea.
What are the markers that you'll watch, Robert, to see whether this is something that progresses beyond the talking stage or whether this is something that kind of dies in the crib?
Well, I think we're in an environment now where things happen so quickly that I'm not sure there would be any markers in advance of this happening.
Fair.
But our friends at the Government Accountability Office have a great roadmap to follow to gauge the potential success of efforts like this. Key questions to ask to ascertain government reforms. Have you figured out why you're doing this? What are you hoping to accomplish? Have you consulted the employees, and what benefit will it be to them? Do you have a plan and the resources to accomplish the reorganization? Because it's not going to be free, it's not going to be easy. You need leadership in charge and a plan with milestones to measure progress towards getting it done. So I want to see those building blocks in place, as GAO will be watching, to make sure that if it's undertaken, it'll be successful.
Just very quickly, too, it won't be fast either. This
will,
sounds like something that would take a while.
No, we're still working on the Department of Homeland Security.
20 years later.
That's right.
Robert Shea, Scott Quell, it's great to have both of you on the program. Thanks for joining me. You can read more about the Postal Service proposal and all the items we talked about on today's show page at fedgovtoday.com. Up next, the Pentagon's budget authorizers get down to business. Fed Gov Today with Francis Rose. Be back in a moment.
Gartner is saying now that in 2025, 50% of all Gen Is will include the knowledge graphs. It's the next, what's happening in most of the AI, call it the AI practitioners now, the leaders in AI, they're all going to the knowledge graph now too, because it's a progression. It's not replacing anything out of the Gen AI, it's adding more value. So that's where everything's heading. So the government's going to get there.
AI now included with Acrobat is able to review the document only, and it doesn't train other than in that document, meaning it pulls data just from that one source. It's not going out to the internet. It's not going out and pulling from these other sources where the data becomes convoluted, or it becomes dangerous, or it becomes less accurate. Mm-hmm. So those two examples are really a key where Adobe is concerned in thinking about generative AI and how we create the data for our customers.
Welcome back. The Office of the Secretary of Defense says 17 areas are off limits to cuts in the defense budget the Trump administration will undertake. OSD says it'll shift $50 billion as part of what it calls a, quote, relook. Major General Arnold Punaro, U.S. Marine Corps retired, as president and CEO of the Punaro Group. His latest book is titled, If Confirmed, An Insider's View of the National Security Confirmation Process. General, welcome. It's great to have you back on the program. As you look at the relook, what do you expect to see the areas that are not exempt among those that are not in those 17 areas that DOD will take a relook at?
Well, Francis, it's a privilege to be with you. This is a subject you and I have dealt with for many decades together. And we need to get more bang for the buck in the Department of Defense for the dollars we spend. And I applaud the new Secretary for taking this on. And I think they're going to be looking at the overhead. They're going to be looking at the size of the Office of the Secretary of Defense. They're going to be looking at the 28 defense agencies. They're going to be looking at the size of the civilian workforce, which is over 800,000 people. Since 9/11, we've actually increased the size of the civilian workforce, and we've decreased the size of the active duty warfighting force. So I think the new Secretary has got to focus on lethality and warfighting, and in my judgment, that's the right focus for the Department of Defense.
Where do you expect to see the money that comes from those areas go to, General?
Well, there's some priorities that he's actually articulated and that the President talked about in the campaign. You're going to see a sizable increase in what they were referring to now as the Golden Dome, which will be missile protection over the United States of America and our territories. I think you're going to see additional money going to some of the high technology areas where we're a little bit behind, maybe a lot behind, like hypersonics, certainly investment in artificial intelligence and things of that nature. He's going to be improving the warfighting readiness of our military forces. So these are the right priorities in my judgment.
How much latitude does the administration have before they start to run into trouble, into dissonance from the 4 jurisdictional committees on the Hill?
Well, as you know, the current law under, Article 1, no money shall be spent except in appropriation from the Treasury by law. And so the committees, once they submit the FY26 budget, and by the way, as you know, we haven't passed the FY25 budget, and we're in a real danger of having a year-long continuing resolution, which would be devastating to the Department of Defense. And so Congress kind of needs to get its act together too. But once they get the FY26 budget, like they always do, they'll look at it very carefully, the authorizers and the appropriators, and make judgments about the change in priorities. I think there's going to be a lot of support for a number of the new priorities. Obviously, there are always going to be concerns, but I think, again, as long as it fits under a strategic rubric that we want to increase deterrence, because the last thing we want to do is go to war. But if we do have to go to war with one of our adversaries, we want to be able to win those wars. And so that's, I think, where the focus is of the new Secretary of Defense and the administration.
You hit on the Hill dynamic, too, that I wanted to bring up next, which is we don't have a budget for 25 yet. 26 is around the corner.
Right.
New administration typically takes a new administration longer to submit their request. So there's still a lot of moving parts here as far as knowing where the money's going to go for this year, let alone for next year.
That's correct. And again, I want to underscore, I hate to say it, but when it comes to the appropriation process, first of all, the individuals are great. Don't get me wrong. The national security leadership on both sides of the aisle, very strong, but the processes in the Congress are totally broken. I refer to it as the broken branch. They haven't passed 12 appropriation bills in a quarter of a century. And again, we've never had a year-long CR in defense. We're at grave risk of having one because of the breakdown. They're focused on this reconciliation bill, which is going to be important, but we also need to pass the appropriation bills.
Well, the NDAA process is about to get underway in both chambers for 2026. What do you expect to see, and how do you expect this relook to potentially influence that?
Well, I would say the authorizers have an unbroken great record of passing the NDAA for 62 straight years. I have every confidence they'll do it again. The Senate Armed Services Committee is very focused on confirmations right now. The Department of Defense has 65 positions, all the top civilian leadership positions, requiring Senate confirmation. Of which we only have actually 2 people confirmed of the 65. We've got a lot in the pipeline, so they need to focus on that. The second thing is we're going to have some senior military replacements. There have been some changes there, as you well know. The new people that are going to be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the chief of naval operations and other senior have to go through the Senate confirmation process. So the SASC is going to be working on both the FY26 budget when they get it, and they've already had a couple of combatant commander hearings, but they're also going to be very focused, and they have 5 positions at the Department of Energy that run the nuclear administration, so they have to do those as well.
I mentioned your book, If Confirmed, An Insider's View of the National Security Confirmation Process. What's your sense of how well that's tracking right now as far as getting the nominees vetted, getting them before the committees?
Well, I would also give the new administration high marks, particularly compared to Trump 1. They're well ahead of their pace. Double the number of people in the cabinet that they've gotten confirmed early on as compared to the first time. It doubled the number of the Biden administration. We have 15 nominations pending for the Senate in the Senate Armed Services Committee. That's a pace well in advance of the previous pace. What happens, though, is once they get out of Armed Services Committee, the SASC is not the problem. They get out on the Senate floor, and then they get put in purgatory, these interminable holes that people put on the nominations, and then the majority leader has to use the cloture process, which burns a lot of time in the Senate. So we're encouraging, in my book, I encourage some major reforms into how the confirmation process works. It's kind of broken, just like the process for the budget is broken.
I enjoyed the conversation with you about your book on the Fed Gov Today podcast. That's in our archive at fedgovtoday.com, and it's great to have you on the show, General.
Well, it's a privilege to be here.
You can read more about the defense budget and the NDAA on today's show page at fedgovtoday.com. Up next, purchase card problems possibly coming to every agency. Fed Gov Today with Francis Rose continues in a moment.
Gartner is saying now that in 2025, 50% of all Gen Is will include the knowledge graphs. It's the next, what's happening in most of the AI, call it the AI practitioners now, the leaders in AI, they're all going to the knowledge graph now too, because it's a progression. It's not replacing anything out of the Gen AI, it's adding more value. So that's where everything's heading. So the government's going to get there.
From where I stand, that AI is here at this point. It's not going to be here, it's here, right? And we need to really try to instill that culture of like, how do we make AI actually a part of our work? And I think, to me, this is where HR and the investment in HR makes a huge difference, right? If you think about it from a business function, what is the only function that hits?
Welcome back. The General Services Administration has a new purchase card limit through its Smart Pay program. The old limit was $10,000. The new limit is $1. Alan Thomas is owner of Alpha Tango Strategies. He's former commissioner of the Federal Acquisition Service at GSA. Alan, welcome. Thanks for joining me. What's your sense of what's behind that cut? That's pretty significant and is putting people, I imagine, inside the agency in quite a bind.
It's a limit, right, that they put on. The agency's trying to get control of spend, right? I mean, there's an old rule, one of the best ways to get control of an organization is to get control of what it's spending, right? And so the limit, I think, and there is, by the way, a review and approval process, right, to be able to go above the limit, because you can't buy much for $1, which I think is part of the point. But really, it's a tactic to kind of get control of the spend within the agency and make sure that there's a proper review of what's going through the card program.
GSA is encouraging other agencies to do the same thing, but it's not mandating that they do the same thing. What's the potential impact of that on the agencies and the way they get things, and on the vendors that sell to the agencies through the purchase card program if that happens?
Yeah, so there could be some mission impacts, right, if other agencies were to adopt that dollar limit. It really depends on what's that review and approval process to be able to buy mission critical things with the card that you need, right? What does that look like? How burdensome is that? Is that something that's quick and easy or not? You take an agency like a VA, a Veterans Affairs, for example, they rely on the card quite a bit to operate hospitals. And so if there was a lengthy, burdensome review process there, right, if VA did adopt this limit, and they have not to my knowledge yet, but if they did, that could have some mission impact on VA. Vendors are obviously concerned about it also, right? There are a number of vendors out there who do, who kind of rely on the government purchase card. And so they, I think the hair on the back of their neck is up a bit, right, on this. But my sense is, take a breath, don't overreact. I do think it's part of this broader effort, right, of DOGE, and DOGE sees GSA really as a key node to kind of get control of spending in the government. So my sense is that's why it was put in place. There's going to be a review period. There probably will be some changes to the Smart Pay program, which GSA runs and administers on behalf of the government. And I think this is sort of part and parcel of that look that the new team is doing.
In addition to the spending control, is it possible that part of the effort here is to determine what people are using the purchase card on that maybe they don't need to if they would use other vehicles, or is that data already knowable? Does that data already exist somewhere?
No, you would think that data does exist. It doesn't, right? In fact, GSA started kind of a special program called the Commercial Platforms Program with a few vendors, and part of the impetus for that program was to get better control of data going through the purchase card program. So there is probably a data component to it as well that I think you could see sort of become part of a revamped Smart Pay program.
Another revamp that we're hearing about is potentially changes to the federal acquisition regulation to kind of wrap around all of those kinds of changes. What does that look like in your view?
Correct. I think if you're kind of reading the tea leaves, right, you've seen some of the press releases come out of GSA where they've recently issued a couple of deviations to the FAR to sort of get in line with some of the president's executive orders, particularly around DEI programs. My sense is, just from reading those, that there could be a whole series of changes that GSA would like to champion within the FAR, and it could pair nicely. There's some proposed legislation on the Hill called the Forged Act, which Senator Wicker put out. It's DoD focused, but there is a big component in there around buying much more like a commercial entity. You could see those two things sort of get paired together, but my sense is you could see some big changes coming, big proposed changes in the FAR. Now look, the FAR is a regulation. Some of it's regulatory. You can change it relatively quickly through the rulemaking process. I say quickly in Washington time. Some of it's statutory, right, that's in the FAR. So that you would need legislation to change there.
We have about a minute left. One of the things that the first Trump administration was known for was consolidating the vehicles by which agencies could buy stuff. Do you expect to see more of that? What's left to consolidate? Because a lot of consolidation happened, as I said, the first time around.
I think you may see some of that, right? If you're looking for overlap and duplication, right, there's a whole suite of government-wide vehicles at GSA like Alliant and Oasis. There's NASA SOUP. There's the CIOSP set of vehicles out of NIH NITAC. There's even things at the service level like Army MAPS, which they're working on. If you were to draw a Venn diagram of the scope of all those acquisition vehicles, Francis, there would be a lot of overlap. And so if you're looking for reducing duplication, that's an easy area. It's also, I think, a good way to control spend. Fewer vehicles means it's easier to figure out who's spending money on what.
Is it easier for the vendors and therefore cheaper for the vendors and therefore cheaper for the government if that happens too?
Absolutely, right? Vendors spend a lot of bid and proposal money, right? And if you're having to bid on a lot of these government-wide things that have overlapping scope, right? No one feels like they can sit them out, right? So they spend the B&P money. That B&P money just gets built back into rates that get charged to the government.
Alan Thomas, it's great to have you on the program. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
You can read more about the acquisition landscape on today's show page at fedgovtoday.com. Fed Gov Today continues in a moment.
So we're using generative AI as an extension for code modernization. We take an approach that's based in data science and linguistic theory, and we essentially reverse engineer the code into a language neutral model, much the way that a human who was bilingual could have multiple languages in their brain. We're able to have multiple languages in this model. And then we extract from that pseudocode and some initial Java code. Where the Gen AI comes into place is not to be like a one-stop, the code going through it. It's to augment what comes out of the traditional methods and generate natural language.
Welcome back. In today's event spotlight, ACT IAC's Emerging Tech Demo Day is coming March 19th at the Carasoft Conference Center in Reston. You'll see live demos of emerging technology solutions, products, and tools focused on outcomes. The day wraps up with 4 lightning round presentations. You can read more about the event and register at fedgovtoday.com/events. FedGov Today TV returns next Sunday morning at 10:30 with federal government experts on IT transformation, acquisition, and data. I'm Francis Rose. I'll see you then. Thanks very much for watching. Have a great week.